welcome back to Diabetes Self-Management. We're going to be talking about the next part in our series, which is everybody's favorite, food. So you're going to learn the nutrition basics, everything to do with nutrition and diabetes. We're going to talk about carb counting. We're going to talk about meal planning. We're going to cover a lot of information in this series. Just as a review, diabetes is controlled by what three main things? Hopefully you remember: medication, exercise, and nutrition. So let's delve into the nutrition. Again, when we eat food, some of those foods that we're eating break down into blood sugar or blood glucose, and the insulin acts as a key that comes and unlocks our cells and helps the sugar get into those cells. So when we eat food, some of those foods break down into blood glucose or blood sugar you may be more familiar with. And again, insulin comes in and unlocks those muscle cells and gets the sugar from the blood into those cells for our bodies to use. Now, when it comes to diabetes and nutrition, there are three main things that affect our blood sugar levels. So when we're eating, so timing, what's on our plate, and how much we are eating, so the portion sizes. So a lot of times, and when I have patients, they come to me and they have skipped breakfast, they've skipped lunch, and they only have one meal a day. So as somebody with diabetes, we really should be eating at least every 4 to 5 hours. And that's because it makes a big effect on our blood sugar. So when we have 3 small balanced meals per day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, what does that look like in terms of our blood sugars? Our blood sugars in that case are going to be doing a very smooth roller coaster ride all throughout the day. Now, when we just have one meal a day, say for example, we have had breakfast, but then we got so busy at work that we skipped lunch. What happens in that case? On our way home, this guy appears. That's the hunger monster, okay? And we go home, we can't even wait to go home, so we drive through the drive-thru, and then we have a huge meal. And what happens with our blood sugar when we do that? It goes astronomically high and it spikes. So to combat this, we really should be having, again, meals every 4 to 5 hours, even every 3 to 4 hours, but consistently throughout the day. When I'm coaching patients about this, one method that really works for a lot of folks is to do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and to have 2 small snacks in between that time. So you're eating 5 times throughout the day. That works for a lot of people, but at least at minimal having breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the next part, what we are eating. Yes, that does make a huge effect on our blood sugars. So let's kind of review the 5 main food groups. We've got protein, we've got grains and starchy vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, fruit, and then dairy. And dairy comprises of milk and yogurt. So let's break those down into their main components and see what we're actually talking about, these 3 macronutrients. So all of those foods break down into proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Let's start with proteins. So proteins are the building blocks in our body. They're essential for good health, and they make up many more things than just muscle. So a lot of people think muscle, and that's the only thing they think of. But it also it comprises of bones. Proteins are comprised in our organs and in our hormones as well. So there's a lot of other parts to protein foods. Now, again, sources of protein foods, most people just think of animal meat. That's the number one thing that they normally think of. But there are plant-based proteins as well. So we've got beef, in this example, chicken, that's salmon, beans, legumes, dairy, nuts, and seeds. All of these things make up protein-containing foods. But remember, a little bit goes a long way in terms of some protein foods. We want to make sure we're only having, for example, a 1/4 cup of nuts at a time. That's considered an actual serving of nuts, or 3 ounces of meat. So 3 ounces, we like to say, is about the size of your palm, or a deck of cards could also be used as a visual there. And there are several tips when it comes to protein foods. So go lean, the less legs the better. So what do I mean by that? So a lot of patients think that I'm talking about chicken legs. I'm not talking about chicken legs. I'm talking about the source of your protein. So if you've got a steak in front of you and then you've got a piece of chicken and then you've got a piece of fish, go back to where that came from. So when you've got a steak, where did that come from? It came from a cow. Cow has 4 legs, okay? Then we've got a piece of chicken. Where did that piece of chicken come from? Kind of gives it away in the name, but it has 2 legs. Chickens have 2 legs. And then how many legs does a fish have? None. Has 0 legs. So when I'm saying less legs the better, that's what I'm talking about. Those fish are going to have a lot less fats in them than something like a steak. It comes from a cow. Also, if you're buying beef products, you want to get 90-10. So what that means is it's 90% lean, 10% fat. So we want that bottom number to be as low as possible when we're buying products. And that way we're buying leaner products to stock in our kitchens. You also want to remove any visible skin and visible fat from the product. Again, we're talking about leanness factor. And then the preparation and the way that you're making those foods. Grilling, baking, broiling are going to be a lot leaner techniques than something like frying, right? And also the cuts of meat that we're purchasing. So if you're looking at a piece of meat and it says sirloin or tenderloin, anything with that loin or round in them is going to be a leaner cut of meat. And I like to point out, you don't always have to have animal proteins, okay? We can have plant-based proteins and that's totally okay. So if you want to have a day where you have meatless Monday or fish on Fridays, any way of kind of lessening the amount of animal proteins, it's actually going to be more beneficial for you in the long run. Now, in terms of diabetes direct effect, animal proteins do not raise blood glucose. A lot of people are surprised to learn this, but they do not contain carbohydrates. They are strictly a protein food, okay? So they have 0 carbs, but in the long run, they're adding to a lot of fat in our diet, a lot of saturated fats. They're manipulating our cholesterol levels. So in the long run, it does affect our diabetes. But when we're talking about carb counting, animal proteins do not contain carbohydrates. Now the next macronutrient is fat. So fats are in the body, they have, there's different types of fats. There's unsaturated, there's saturated, and there's trans. Again, fats do not contain carbohydrates, so they're not going to directly affect your blood sugar in terms of spiking it, but it does impact, again, our cholesterol, our weight, and our heart health, which are all side effects of complications of diabetes that could come upon later in life. So we've got unsaturated fats. They have a green light. So what does green mean? Green means go, right? Those are healthy fats. So let's see the sources of unsaturated fats. So we've got nuts and seeds, avocado, tuna, we've got olive oil, salmon, olives, and then that last piece is tofu, if you may be familiar with it. These are going to have different types of fats in them called poly and monounsaturated, both of which are just a type of unsaturated fat. You may be more familiar with the term omega-3 fatty acids. Those omega-3s, a lot of people are more familiar with, and those are considered a polyunsaturated fat. So those omega-3s are going to be found in some nuts and seeds like walnuts are really good sources of omega-3s. Our salmon, our olive oil is going to be more so with monounsaturated fats, but either way, those are just different types. And replacing our fats in our diet, so replacing our saturated and our trans fats with more of these types of fats are going to have a lot of benefits to our health. It's going to lower our cholesterol and it's going to increase satisfaction. So what I mean by that is if you have something that has a little bit of fat in it, you're actually going to have a more fullness factor than you would be if you didn't have any. But again, a little bit goes a long way. An avocado, if you eat a whole avocado, you're looking at about 350 to 400 calories. Per gram, the fats are going to have 9 calories per gram versus 4 calories per gram in proteins and carbohydrates. So you're getting more calories here, but very nutrient dense. Now the second type of fat is saturated fats. These have a yellow light. So yellow meaning what? Caution, right? So these you want to be mindful about. Saturated fats, when you are buying, where do these come from? They're mainly found, again, in animal proteins, but a lot of times they're also in processed foods. So our bacon, our chicken wings, our donuts, a lot of times they're going to be in these highly processed foods, and they're going to be in foods that typically also have a lot of sodium in them. So it's not stuff that we necessarily need. This is why we have caution signs. Also, when you're thinking about fats that you're adding in your diet or cooking with, a lot of times these are saturated fats. So our butter, our cheese, our Crisco, cream cheeses, heavy creams, all of these are going to be saturated fat sources. A really good way to just look at a fat and be able to tell if it's saturated or not is if it's solid at room temperature. Okay, so butter is solid at room temperature, Crisco is solid at room temperature, and those are both considered saturated fats. So just quick glance looking at it, that's a really good tip to learn, is just if it's solid or not. Now, again, these typically are found in animal proteins, but if we are replacing these types of fats, for example, if a recipe calls for butter and you're using olive oil instead, that's what we want you to do. So replacing these saturated fats with more unsaturated sources. It's not that you can't have the fats, it's just editing the type of fat that you're using on a daily basis. Trans fats have a red light. So these are no go, no good, stop. So these are not very good for you, and for the most part, they've actually been removed from the food industry. A lot of them have been removed, but some companies are still, they're tricky and they're putting them in there anyways. Again, a lot of this is going to be in processed foods. Trans fats are not actually something that's in nature, it's man-made. And these are going to have a huge effect on our cholesterol levels and our weight as well. So like I said, these companies are tricky, and legally they can claim that something has 0 grams of trans fats if it's less than 0.5 grams in that food item. So a food may still have trans fats in there, but they don't have to claim it. So this, for example, this Coffee Mate creamer says 0 grams of trans fats, but it actually contains trans fats. And the way that you can see that is if you pay attention to the ingredient list. So when you're panning over to that ingredient list and you see that term hydrogenated in the ingredient list, that's something that was liquid at one point that they've pumped hydrogen into and now made it a hydrogenated oil, aka a solid oil, and it contains these trans fats. So that's also one helpful tip that you can learn to see if you're consuming these trans fats or not. We do not want to have these trans fats in our diet if we can help from it. Now again, fats do not contain carbohydrates, okay? They're not going to directly raise our blood sugar, but that does not mean they are free for all. Like protein, a little bit goes a long way, okay? So fats, examples of more fats would be cheese, or peanut butter, avocado. You know, put that one up there, that onion ring, that's a little bit of a tricky one because it is fat, but that breading is going to have carbohydrate in it. So that's a little bit of a trick on this slide, but for most of these, they are not going to have carbohydrates at all. What does affect our blood glucose is carbohydrates, okay? A lot of times when I'm talking with patients, a lot of patients think they cannot have carbs at all. They're diabetic, they can't have carbs. That's not the case. You can have carbs. It's all about moderation and portion control. But the first step is learning where carbs are coming from. So what foods have carbohydrates, okay? So what food groups have carbohydrates in this example? So most people automatically, they say potato. They know the potato has carbohydrates, okay? So carbohydrates are found in grains and starchy vegetables, but they're also found in fruit. A lot of people do not know this, but if you think about it, fruit has fructose, which is a type of fruit sugar, and that's a carbohydrate. And then milk also contains lactose. So you've probably heard of people being lactose intolerant. That lactose is the type of milk sugar, and that's what has the carbohydrate in there. So dairy, fruit, grains, and starchy vegetables all have carbohydrates. The protein, animal proteins, do not have carbs. okay? And then the non-starchy vegetables, those are not going to have carbs or significant source of carbs. But these three groups do. So let's break those down one by one. Let's start with dairy. So we've got sources of dairy. So when it comes to what we're recommending, we really want to go with a skim or 1% milk when we're stocking our refrigerators. That's going to, again, talking about leanness, that's really going to help with that leanness factor. Or if you can't tolerate milk, another thing that you can do is get like a soy milk or an almond milk, or they've got oat milk, hemp milk, pea milk. They've got all kinds of milks that you can get. With those, you just want to make sure you're purchasing unsweetened milk. Okay, so unsweetened plant-based milks, or a skim or 1% if you're going to go with a dairy milk coming from a cow. You can also get low-fat and non-fat yogurt, but make sure you're comparing the sugar on those yogurts, because sometimes if you're getting those pre-sweetened yogurts, they can have quite a bit of sugar in them. Now when it comes to fruits, fruit contains natural sugar, which makes them a source of carbohydrates. Now there's several tips when it comes to fruit when we're making these choices. So fresh or frozen is the best option. Now this is coming from fruits and vegetables later on. Fresh or frozen is perfectly fine. You don't have to go in and buy the whole produce section at your grocery store. You can get frozen things, and that's okay. You just want to make sure that they're just the natural fruit in their natural state and they're not sweetened with something. Same thing if you're buying a canned product, you want to make sure it's canned in its own juice. And again, a whole fruit is going to be better than juice. So a lot of people are surprised in just a half a cup of apple juice. It takes 8 apples to do that. And you would never eat 8 apples in one sitting, and that's because the skin has something called fiber in it that helps us to feel full. And fiber also acts in our bodies to digest more slowly. So if we're just having juice, it's going to spike our blood sugars, and our blood sugars are going to rise really quickly, as opposed to if we have a piece of fruit with the fiber, that's going to digest more slowly, and it's not going to spike our blood sugars as much as we would be if we were just having fruit. So always, always have the whole piece of fruit instead of the juice. Also, buy a variety of colors. So eat the rainbow, but we're not talking about Skittles, we're talking about fruit. The next part is starch. So this is the one most people are familiar with in terms of containing carbohydrates. So sources of starch include our grains, which a lot of people, yes, they know that. They don't realize starchy vegetables are also considered a starch, or that there are even such thing as starchy vegetables. Sources of grains would be something like pasta or bread or rice, quinoa, wheat. All of these are grains. You even see popcorn kernels up there. Those are considered a grain. So when we're counting our carbs, be mindful, these contain our carbohydrates. Now there's a couple of tips when it comes to starch foods as well. So with grains, you want to make sure that at least half of your grains are considered whole grains. So what do I mean by that? I mean to look at the first ingredient on that ingredient label, and you want to see that word WHOLE, whole, in the ingredient list. That's going to signal to you that that is a whole grain product. So it'll either say whole wheat or whole grain. You don't want it to say enriched white flour. That basically means that it has been stripped away in its natural form and then added a whole bunch of vitamins back to it, when you could just be having the original form, less processed version in the whole wheat. So I have a couple of examples here. Instead of white bread, buying whole wheat bread, okay? And not looking, again, when you're buying that whole wheat, make sure that it is a whole wheat product. A lot of people tell me they have honey wheat. That's not a whole wheat product. So we got to make sure we are buying a whole wheat product, and preferably one that does not have molasses or sugar in it. So again, these companies are tricky, and you can't just go off the color of your bread. So a lot of times they will add molasses to it because molasses is brown, and then it turns it brown. People think they're buying a healthy product, but they're actually getting something that has more sugar in it. Instead of buying white rice, buying brown rice or a wild rice or a black rice is going to give you a whole grain. Instead of buying white pasta noodles, buy a whole grain pasta noodle. And instead of having something like Fruit Loops or sugary cereal, you want to have something that has a minimal amount of sugar as possible. So something like a plain Cheerios or shredded wheat that's not frosted. You could also do bran flakes, not the Raisin Bran, that's going to have a lot of sugar in it, but bran flakes as well. And those are just some other examples. Now, some people are surprised to learn that there are starchy vegetables and that this is a designation from vegetables as a whole. When you go to a restaurant in the South and we order a veggie plate, what are we going to get? We're going to get mashed potatoes, we're going to get corn, we're going to get lima beans, we're going to get all these starches, right? It's all starchy vegetables. So we want to be mindful that these do contain starch. So stuff like yams, regular potatoes, even some winter squashes, so acorn squash, butternut squash, corn, many types of peas as well as beans are going to be in this category. Now they're going to count in this case as a starch, so they would go the same place as the potato. So if you weren't having a potato and you were having lima beans in that example on the bottom right, then that would be counted as your starch. It would be in that starch group. Now the last category is these non-starchy vegetables. They've saved the best for last, and the reason being is because we want these to be the majority of your plate. They are low in calories, high in nutrients, so they're going to have a very little effect on your blood glucose. It's not a significant amount of carbohydrates here, so you can have a lot of these types of vegetables, and in fact we want you to bulk up on these types of vegetables and these types of foods. So what are examples of some non-starchy vegetables? So we've got tomatoes, broccoli, squash. Now I said squash earlier, but those were winter squashes. These are summer squashes. So yellow squash, zucchini, green beans, snap peas, cauliflower. If you're wondering what that item is in the bottom center, that is cactus, and that's because we have a lot of Hispanic patients here at Church Health, so you may like cactus. It's actually really delicious, but that's considered a non-starchy vegetable. Now this is a trick question, but where do sugary drinks and sweets go on the plate? They don't go anywhere. They don't belong on your plate. Now that doesn't mean that you can never have them, but be mindful that these contain very little nutrition. They're considered empty calories, and they really need to be limited. The amount of sugar in some of these foods or drinks is going to be staggering. Just one soda, for example, has about 10 teaspoons or so of sugar. Gatorade has a very similar amount of sugar in it. And a lot of people will switch from Coke to Gatorade because they think they're making a better choice, but not so much. The Frappuccinos and the energy drinks, they're going to have a lot of sugar in them. So just be mindful and really keep this to be very, very limited. Now this is testing your knowledge a little bit, so play along with me if you're doing this at home. So which of the following have a significant amount of carbohydrates? The first line here, there's only one piece. That's the source of carbohydrate in the second list. The second row, strawberries, yes, because it's a fruit, has the fructose, remember? Then we've got lemonade, and we don't know if that's diet lemonade or not, but for this example, we're going to say it's real sugar, so real lemonade. And then we've got cornbread as well. That's going to be a grain, so a significant source of carbohydrates. Now this bottom line, let's see, what do y'all think? We've got Cheerios. Most people were going to bet on the donut and on the spaghetti. So also taking this into practice, we're going to test our knowledge. In something like this, where would the carbohydrates be? Okay, we're looking at it in our drink. What do we got? We've got orange juice, okay, made from oranges. It's sweet for sure. Now we've got our toast and we've got our pancakes. Now remember, animal proteins do not contain carbohydrates. They contain a lot of other things, such as fats, but they're not going to contain carbohydrates. The only significant source of carbs in this example would be pancakes, toast, and orange juice. Now what about for here? We don't know, we're gonna say that's tea. Okay, we don't know if that's sweet or unsweet. We've got a piece of fish with some spices on it, we've got rice, and we've got non-starchy vegetables. So the only significant source that we know of is coming from the rice, okay? And in this example, like I said, we don't know about the tea, so it's gonna have a question mark. Now what about here? We've got a burger, we've got fries, and we've got a drink. So where are the significant source of carbohydrates coming from? The Coke, the French fries, and the bun. So this is probably what most people would order at a fast food burger place. And if we were keeping that plate in mind, something that I like to tell folks is that, again, it doesn't mean you can never have fast food again, okay? You can still make this work, this plate method work, if you're on the go. So if you were going to order a burger, for example, you could have that burger. I would get a water or a diet drink instead of that Coke. And then instead of French fries, we want, again, the bulk of our food to come from non-starchy vegetables. So you could order something like a side salad instead of those French fries, and that would be closer to that plate than it would be if you ordered something like this. Okay, so in terms of carb counting, you may have heard this term before, and it can be a little confusing and a little overwhelming if you're not familiar with what it is. But carb counting is something that you do as somebody with diabetes. Now, somebody with type 1 diabetes, they must carb count because they're relying on external insulin, and their insulin dosage is going to depend on how many carbs that they're having in a day. If you're a type 2 diabetic, and you would like to carb count, this is going to give you much better control over your diabetes. It's going to give you more consistency. It's going to help those medications to work better. It's going to give the doctor more control over how he can help you, and it's going to give your dietitian more control over how to guide you as well. But let's talk about carb counting and get into the nitty-gritty. So carb counting, we pretty much know that if we in general have too many carbohydrates, it's going to increase our blood sugar, right? In this first example, we've got a Coke, we've got garlic bread, and we've got spaghetti. Lots and lots of carbohydrates. It's going to make those blood sugars skyrocket. Now, the same token, you can have too few carbs as well. Again, I get a lot of people with diabetes who say, well, I can never have bread, or I can never have whatever. And that's not the case either. You want to have a moderate amount of carbs, because if you don't, your blood sugars can go low. And if you've ever had a low blood sugar, that can be quite a scary event. And we've talked about that in a previous series. In this example, they did not have a significant source of carbohydrates for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. So if you look at it, their plate is actually unbalanced. So what is considered a serving of carbs? You may remember from a previous session where I talked about the magical number in diabetes is 15 from the rule of 15. So it also applies with food. So one carbohydrate serving is considered 15 grams of carbohydrates. Okay, that's just one carbohydrate serving for a diabetic patient. So what does 15 grams look like? This is just something to keep in mind. We're going to get into how many you should actually have in a day later, but this is just to give you a backbone. So in one piece of toast, in one apple, and generally around 1 cup of milk, those are all going to contain around 15 grams of carbohydrates. So how many grams of carbohydrates should we be aiming for in a day? If you are a man and you are just needing weight maintenance, generally you're going to want to have 4 to 5 carbohydrate choices per meal, and you're going to look about 60 to 75 grams of carbohydrates. Now just be mindful that is per meal. Okay, so for breakfast, again for lunch, again for dinner. If you're wanting to lose weight as a man, you would look for about 3 to 4 choices per meal. That's going to give you about 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrates. If you're a female and you want to lose some weight, you're going to want to stay 30 to 45 grams per meal. And if you're wanting weight maintenance, 45 to 60 grams per meal. So So the caveat to this is I've had somebody say, so I can have 90 grams in a day. That's the way they want to remember it, 90 grams in a day. That's a little dangerous because you don't want to skip breakfast, skip lunch, and then have 90 grams at dinner, and then you're about to go to sleep. So if you skip that meal, then you've skipped it. You don't get to add those carbohydrates back, but this is per meal. 3 meals per day is what we really want to aim for, okay? And then 15 grams per snack. Generally speaking, I'll get into specifics, but generally speaking, you're going to get quite a bit of carbs throughout the day, but this is still considered carb restricted. So in order to figure out how many carbs is in a food, we're going to want to know how to read a food label. If you're a patient here at Church Health, we also have carb counting booklets that we will give you if you come in and be seen by us. And you can also look up nutrition facts online. A vast majority of restaurants have their nutrition information online and available to you that you can look up. But we want to know the steps of how to read a food label. It can be quite intimidating if you don't know what to look for. But the first thing you want to do is look at the serving size. That is the first step in knowing what to look for on a nutrition label, is looking at the serving size. The second step is to look at what you're wanting to eat, because it may change your decision based on what the serving size is. So if you're wanting to look at something that's got it's 4 cups, and then the serving size is 1 cup, and that's 15 grams of carb, and you were looking at this for a snack, that's going to be too much. So it could edit your decision. First step is to look at the serving size. Second step is to compare it to your portion that you want to eat. The third step is to locate the total carbohydrates. So a lot of old school people with diabetes, they only want to look at the sugar. They look at the sugar and that's it. But we actually want to look at the carbohydrates, hence carb counting. Sugars are going to be included in that, but carb counting is the total carbohydrates is going to give you much more control. So looking at the total carbohydrates is the third step, and then you want to look at the fiber and then consequently at the sugar. So it has compare the sugar content. So that example is talking about if you've got 2 yogurts, for example, they've got the exact same amount of carbs, so say both have 15 grams of carbs, but one has 10 grams of sugar and the other one has 3. You're going to want to pick the one that has less sugar, but that's subsequently to the total carbohydrates. So in steps, you're going to look at that second. And then you're going to check out the saturated fats, the trans fats, hopefully those are 0, and the sodium, okay? So generally speaking, we want to stay below 15 grams or so of saturated fats in a day, just to give you a ballpark number of what's considered high and low. For sodium, you want to stay under 2,300 milligrams in a day. If you've got high blood pressure already, you're going to look at closer to 1,500 milligrams in a day. But just if you're scanning a food and you pan over to the percentiles on the right, what you can look for is the numbers there, and you're going to see a range of 0 to 100. If it's 5 or lower than 5, that's considered low in that nutrient. So if you're looking at sodium, you want to look for 5% or less. If it's 20% or higher, that's considered high. Okay, so again, in terms of sodium, if you see something that's 32% sodium, that's a really high sodium food. Probably best not to have that type of food. So this is where the serving size also comes in. So what does 15 grams look like? So if you're wanting to pour you a bowl of cereal and you pour the bowl before you're looking at how many carbs is in that bowl, you could be having your entire carb allowance. For example, if you're a woman, you're wanting to lose weight, you need to stay between 30 and 45 grams of carbs. If you pour a whole bowl, and that bowl that you just poured was 1.5 cups of, I think in this case, cornflakes, you're looking at 45 grams of carbs. Now that's not including the milk, because remember, dairy also has carbohydrates. So if you're adding 1 cup or 2 of milk in this, you could be looking at 60 plus carbohydrates easily, and then you've gone over for your meal. So it's important to look at those portions and the serving size, because what you think of as a portion may actually count as several servings. So it's important to look at that information. Okay, so at this point, let's head on over to the kitchen and we're gonna make some sample plates because we're going to build a meal together. So let's build a meal together. And I've got my fancy dancy food models here to show you. So let's be mindful, we wanna do half non-starchy vegetables, a quarter protein, and then a quarter carbohydrate or starch foods. You also wanna have a little bit of fruit and some milk. So in this example here, I'm gonna do a vegetarian version first. So in this example, we've got some kidney beans. Those are acting, yes, they contain starch, but in this example, we're gonna use them as a protein. So we've got kidney beans, and then we've got some brown rice. This is specifically 1/3 of a cup of brown rice, which actually is a proper serving size of brown rice that has 15 grams of carbohydrates. So that's a good starting point. If you're gonna have 2/3 of a cup or 1 cup, you're looking at 30 grams of carb and then 45 grams of carb just in that rice. So 1/3 is the serving size. And then we've got some non-starchy vegetables here. In this example, we've got asparagus and broccoli. So if I'm building a meal, I've got my protein, my starch, and my non-starchy vegetable. A little bit of dairy, so this is 4 ounces, so half of a cup. And then I've got 2 apricots. So if we were carb counting this specifically, this is gonna give me about 57 grams of carbohydrates. So if I was trying to stay in the range between 45 and 60 grams of carbs, this would be a good option for me. Now, if I had a little bit lower of a carb restriction and we wanted to build another plate that had an animal protein on it, we have fish, we've got brown rice. This is actually a wild rice, brown rice mix, and it's 1/2 of a cup here. And then we've got some spinach, some lettuce, tomato. We've got a whole cup of milk, as well as some blackberries, okay? So if we were gonna have something like this, we've got our protein, our starch, half non-starchy vegetables, some milk, and our fruit. We've got all the categories that we need to build a healthy meal. And in this case, this would be 45 grams of carbohydrates. Now there's some other examples here. You can see we've got half non-starchy vegetables. These are cauliflower. This is cauliflower, not mashed potatoes. We've got green beans, corn, and some roasted chicken. This is 3 ounces, so this is an appropriate serving size. The starch in this example is our corn, and then we've got non-starchy vegetables from the cauliflower and the green beans. Our last example is we've got 3 ounces. Again, that 3 ounces, you'll see that a lot in the protein, in this case beef. And then we've got yams, that's serving as our starch. And then we've got half non-starchy vegetables. Now, something else I wanted to point out in terms of that less legs the better rule is just the amount of fat that's in these proteins. Not in so much in terms of carb counting, but it is nice to see in a visual display. So if we're talking about beef, just 3 ounces is gonna have about this much fat in it. So that's 3 ounces of beef right here, this tube vial of fat. And this is lean beef, by the way. This chicken, this is roasted without skin. We're looking at about this much of fat in that amount of chicken. And then we've got our fish, which side-by-side comparison, you can definitely see less amount of fat. So that's why we like to say less legs the better, leaner products. Also, in terms of carb counting, a nice rule of thumb for snacks would be something with 15 grams of carbohydrate, for example, a piece of fruit, and then some nuts. So the nuts is not going to be the carbohydrates, but we always want to try to do pairing of carbohydrates with a protein and a fat, and that would be a really good snack example. And then we've got our breakfast, of course. We topped our oatmeal with some pretty little strawberries here. If we had this with a cup of milk, this would be a really good example of a healthy, balanced breakfast. What could make it even better is if we just imagine these are coming apart, but if we sprinkled some nuts on top, give it some protein, that would be a really good breakfast idea, and then a cup of milk. So these are just some foods that I wanted to show you guys as examples. You don't always have to do exactly how that plate demonstration was with the potato and the piece of beef and these non-starchy vegetables, you can do this with other food items as well. Okay, so when we're practicing looking up nutrition facts, we're going to start with an example that some of you may be familiar with. We've got Panda Express. You just went through the line and you've got some chow mein, some fried rice, and some orange chicken on your plate. So in terms of looking up how many carbohydrates are in those foods, Panda Express has their nutrition facts online that you can look up readily available to you. Now we're looking up how many carbs is in this plate. I like to try to guess first, so what do you think? And then comparing it to what it actually is. So again, those goals are 30 to 45 if you're a woman who's wanting to lose some weight. If you're trying to maintain your weight, we're looking at 45 to 60. If you're wanting to lose weight as a man, you're looking at 45 to 60 grams, and then 60 to 75 if you're wanting to maintain. So just keeping those numbers in mind here, the total for something like this is 201 grams of carbohydrates. So it is a lot and way over where we need to be. So just be mindful of that when you're going through the line. This is where that plate method of having one starch food would be a really good way to kind of contradict this, because they try to give you, or they give you a choice of vegetables or carbohydrate containing foods, and in this case you would want to get more of those non-starchies. So there's 91 grams just in the fried rice, 65 grams just in the chow mein, and then the orange chicken, you got 45 grams there. Now you may be thinking, I thought you said animal proteins don't contain carbs. They don't. The carbs are coming from, in this example, the breading and the sauce. So we cannot forget the sauce. And it's going to leave you with 201 grams of carbohydrates and 2,460 milligrams of sodium. And if you remember what I said earlier in the session, our goals for the day are 2,300 milligrams. If you've got high blood pressure, it's even less than that at 1,500 milligrams. So this is way more than anybody needs, and it's definitely not helping in terms of keeping us under our carb goals. Now we've got another example as well. This is if we were going to another very well-known restaurant around here. We've got KFC, and we've got a drumstick, we've got a thigh, biscuit, sauce, regular soda, side of mashed potatoes, and another side of coleslaw. So how many carbohydrates do you think that ends up being? A lot of people are surprised to learn it's less than the Panda Express. However, still, if we have 30 to 45 grams of carbs per meal, it's not a whole lot better, okay? It's way over where we need to be. Again, that doesn't mean you can never go to KFC again. What this is teaching you is that it's really a good thing to do to look up before you even go there how many carbs are in these specific foods. So a side of mashed potatoes is only 19 grams of carbs. That's actually a pretty decent serving size. But in the Coke, you're looking at one regular soda, 16 ounces. There's 56 grams of carbohydrates just in that drink. So you are drinking your meal. We can do without that. We don't need, I'd rather have my carbs on my food than in drinks. So we can do without that meal, do without the sauce, and you're gonna be a lot better off. So just being mindful of where those carbs are coming from and kind of trying to balance accordingly so that you can stay within your goals. Now again, tips for snacking. So I said earlier that generally speaking, we're gonna stay about 15 grams of carbohydrates for snacks. Now that's gonna depend on what your blood sugars are doing, if you wanna be super specific. So keeping it light, less than 5 grams, that's gonna be things strictly that don't have carbs. Something like nuts, for example, is gonna give you less than 5 grams if we're talking about, a quarter cup of nuts or so. That's running high. When I say running high, I mean if you're running above your goals, so say you've eaten something and you're running above 180 in your blood sugars, then that's considered running high. So remember, your fasting goals are between 80 and 140, and then postprandial, or after you've eaten, it's between 140 and 180. So if you're above those ranges, you're not going to want to add more carbohydrates to your already high sugar level. Okay, so you're going to want to keep it light. If you're in an energy boost, if you need an energy boosting snack, that means that you're within those target ranges, you're good, you can afford a little bit of carbs. So that's where I was talking about, generally speaking, having 15 grams of carbohydrates. Now, if you're gonna exercise, you're gonna need a little bit more carbohydrates to give you that energy, right? And exercise tends to lower our blood sugars, so you can have a little bit more before you can exercise. However, it does depend on the intensity and your blood glucose specifically before you start. How are we going to actually do this? How are we going to plan to do this at home, cooking for our family? So one thing that I like to tell folks is this pattern of eating really is good for the entire family. If you have diabetes or not, you can really benefit from eating this way. A lot of people as well, in order to do this and to put this into practice, like to make a shopping list or have a healthy grocery list, something that they can kind of use as a guideline. You know, there's definitely some strategies that I tell patients to do if the patient just doesn't have control over themselves and they go to the grocery store. Take somebody with you as kind of an accountability buddy to keep you out of those junk food aisles, those ice cream aisles, and to keep you sticking to your goals. But just being mindful that this way of eating and this cooking, you don't have to feel like you are putting people out or that you have to eat something separate from your family. If you're the one cooking, especially, you can make this for your entire family and you're actually doing them a good service. So also thinking about how you're going to put this into practice in terms of special occasions, so family gatherings, holidays, special events. We want to make sure that we are not being too hard on ourselves, okay? So this is just one day out of the year. You're not gonna totally ruin your goals. You can still have all these foods. You may just need to moderate yourself, have a little bit of all of your foods instead of a whole big portion size of a whole bunch of different things. So you can still reward yourself that way and you can still stay within your carb goal because again, you need a certain amount of carbohydrates throughout the day. Now thinking about traveling as well, this is an important note. So whenever you're traveling, you want to make sure, for one, you have all of your supplies with you. And in terms of food, you want to make sure that you are, some strategies that people can say is, you know, you're looking up where you're going to eat beforehand, you're looking up the nutritional analysis beforehand, that you have healthy snacks with you on the go instead of being tempted to stop and get something not so healthy on the way. But think about what you can do whenever you're traveling and what strategies you're going to use to best control your blood sugars. So again, let's review. Diabetes is controlled and managed by what three main things? We've got exercise, medications, and nutrition, okay? Your blood sugar goals. What are those blood sugar goals? Again, fasting blood sugar should be between 80 and 140, and after meals, your blood sugar should be between 140 and 180. And the next question, what is a serving of carbohydrates? That serving of carbohydrates, remember, 15 is the magic number in diabetes. There's the rule of 15, everything is in increments of 15. One carbohydrate serving is 15 grams of carbohydrates. And then what's next? So for church health patients, we've got me, I'm a registered dietitian. I see the church health patients here. We've also got health coaches and we've got community cooking classes. Now those you do not have to be a church health patient to utilize. Anybody can come to those. You just have to be 16 years of age or older in order to come to that class. Those are super fun. They are in our beautiful teaching kitchen over here. And that's 6 weeks worth of free cooking classes. free cooking classes for 6 weeks. So you come the same time for 6 weeks. It is a commitment to come to those 6-week classes, but you learn a variety of things. You learn about healthy cooking, you learn about healthy cooking strategies, you get to keep all of the recipes that you're making for those classes, and you get to eat. So you can't be better than that. You also, if you're a church health patient specifically, we have a Y here in the building, so it's easy access to the YMCA that is here at Crosstown Concourse. If you want to learn more about any of these classes or signing up for any of these classes, you would just call the number on the screen, 901-701-2220, to learn more information and to sign yourself up. Thank you so much for joining us for these 4 sessions of diabetes self-management. We look forward to hearing from you, and we hope that you come and you utilize our space, you come and you join our classes, come and exercise at the Y. We hope to see you around soon.